Okay everyone, welcome back to another video on the channel today. We're back on GT Sport and we're back with the video that I have been promising for quite a long time now. It's probably been over 6 months. I finally got round to doing the brake bias video, and I think it's actually quite a good idea to do this now on the new physics model that has arrived recently. Now there are some variations in what we're going to talk about. Obviously you've got all the different classes of car, which we're going to talk about variations within that as we go through the video. But what we're going to do in this video is try and give you some sort of base guide to what different settings do. We're going to go to the extremes as well. We're not going to start, go to the perfect settings, because you need to find out your own perfect settings really, because at the end of the day, brake bias is a car setting, and car settings are very unique to your driving style. What will work for me might not work for another driver. It all depends on the way you input your steering wheel and your braking and how you like the car to handle. Some people like a very twitchy over steering car on entry into corners, and then them type of people will go more to the rear with the brake bias. Other people prefer understeer, so they will go in general more to the front with the brake bias, because they want the car to be less aggressive on entry into the corner and more stable than for getting on the power. It's just all variations in terms of how you like the car to handle, and that's why there is no correct way that you run your brake bias. It is just, as a guide, there are ways that might be slightly faster, but it all depends on your driving style as well. And that's why sometimes I think people get too overly concerned with the brake bias. But what we're going to do in this video is try and give you some sort of base guideline to how to run the different cars, how I go about doing it. Now this, like I say, this isn't necessarily the correct way, but this is how we do it. So the different variations of car, we have Group 3 MR cars, and Group 4 obviously, Group 3 and Group 4 FR cars, and then we go to just the Group 4 four-wheel drive and Group 4 front engine front-wheel drive. Obviously in Group 3 you only have the 2 variations, but in Group 4 you have all 4. That's why Group 3 in general is a more balanced class. So we're going to start in MR class, and now these are laps I just jumped on quickly, did some sections of track. This is at Bathurst in the Group 3 Audi R8. Now we're running 5 to the rear brake bias, and what you're going to see now is, because this car is mid-engined and rear-wheel drive, the weight's more to the rear. So when we're running our brake bias to the rear, just watch how overreactive it is and twitching on the brakes, just a tiny amount of brakes, and look at the rear, it just snaps on us. And then we're going to slow this down just to show you. The braking inputs were not aggressive. Just look how little braking input I'm putting into the corner. Then, because we're going downhill, the pendulum effect is going to take place, because the weight's on the rear, the brake bias is also on the rear, so it's just going to emphasize everything that steps the rear out. And that is one of the big reasons why you tend not to go towards the rear too much with MR cars. And then going into this corner, you're going to see this is another example of where it can really catch you out. And again, it's just gone on us, because we've got all the weight to the rear and you're going downhill. Now, in certain circumstances, there are corners where you are going to have the rear, a bit of rear bias in an MR car. There are like Brands Hatch on some of the fast corners, you will want to go slightly to the rear. But for conditions like that, that's why you do more to the rear. We're going to try it again now, separate lap. You can see if we can control it a bit better. But even now, we control it. But look at the oversteer on there, really twitchy. We're trying to be careful, and it just makes it scruffy. It's not stable, it's not smooth, because all the weight's at the rear, and then you're braking all the pressure to the rear of the car. So you're just emphasizing an oversteering car in general. So now we're going to go the other way, -5. Now watch the difference. Because this is an MR car, this car is very this car really needs it towards the front, so this is why I've used this car to really show the difference. Now, much more stable, and then going into the braking, you can see still way more aggressive than we was before, and look how it bites to the inside even though we're on -5, because it's got the weight to the rear. So that really shows you the difference at why we run that setting. Now we're going to go to the AMG GT3. Now this car can run a lot more aggressive with the brake bias. You can see 5 to the rear, and look how much more stable this car is, because the weight is at the front and the drivetrain is at the back. You can see now that it's, even with 5 to the rear, it's actually driving reasonably stable. I wouldn't run 5 to the rear if I was driving this track in this car, but you can see that you can still put a lap in. It's actually getting through the corners reasonably okay. As you see, we're going to do it again, another go with 5 to the rear, and see how it goes through another attempt. And going down the downhill section, you can see that it's very smooth again. It's not stepping out too much. It's not what I would ideally run, because it's still a little bit twitchy, but you can get away with it, the FR car, because the weight's already at the front of the car, And this just emphasises the reason why MR cars, you tend to go more minus brake bias, so more towards the front. So now we're going to go with the FR car and run all the way to the front and show you why you don't tend to run this type of setting with FR cars, because you've already got the weight on the front. This is just going to create a little bit more on the seat. You can see as we go in the down section, not too bad through there, it's reasonably stable, but that section is generally quite stable with front bias. But now watch as we come through to this left hand corner, look at the understeer. We just miss the apex massively, and then because of that you're slower on the power onto the back straight, and you're going to lose a lot of time. And we're going to slow this down now just to show you what I'm talking about. As we go into the corner, you can see that we just can't get any rotation on the car because we're trail braking in the corner, but it's not rotating on us. The front does not want to rotate the rear, it just wants to go straight on. So that is why you do not run Group 3 cars -5 on FR cars. It tends to not really work. Now we're going to go into MR cars in Group 4 and show you what 5 to the rear is like in the Porsche Cayman. This is the example I use for this. Now this car, in general, Group 4 cars on MR can run a little bit more rearward. So what you're going to see now is this is going to be fairly similar to how the Group 3 FR car ran. You can see going into the braking zone, it is a little bit twitchy. The rear is going to go a little bit there, but we managed to catch it. So it's not as bad as the Group 3 car, but again, it shows you don't really want to run 5 to the rear in MR cars. This is my personal opinion anyway. On sections of track like that, it just really emphasises that you want to go a little bit more to the front. You can see that massive oversteer moment there. It kicks in, kicks the rear out, and you're going to just lose too much time. So now we're going to switch it around and go -5. Now, this is not a setting I would run in Group 4 in MR cars, but you're going to see now it is drivable, but it's going to cause understeer because in Group 4 you have more grip anyway. It tends to be not as powerful, so the cars tend to have a little bit more understeer rather than oversteer. We go through to this section of the track now, and what you're going to see is the understeer. Look at the understeer that takes place there. Now really you want to be biting into that apex, and that is the reason why I tend to run the Group 4 car in MR, specifically the Cayman, round about middle to slightly rear bias, maybe +1 to +2. You can see there, just massive understeer. It just doesn't want to rotate again at the rear. Very similar to how the FR Group 3 car took that corner with -5 as well. So now we're going to go to FF cars. Now these cars are a very different type of car to the other cars. Obviously you front engine, front wheel drive, all the weights at the front. So these cars are going to be stable pretty much no matter which way you run the brake bias. However, what you tend to find is most people, and what I will always start off as a base, is going all the way to the rear because you want as much rotation from the car as possible. You see with 5 to the rear, it helps it rotate. You get out that final corner nice and smoothly, and you've got good pace coming out the corner. Now we're going to go the other way, -5. Now what you'll find with this car, the differences between all the way to the front and rear are not as massive as say the Group 3 cars, for example, going all the way to the front to the rear. But what you'll see is you tend to want to try and get more rotation to the rear, and there are other reasons why you will go to the rear with your brake bias when you're doing a race with tyre wear, which we'll talk about after, mainly because where your brake bias is pointing, so if it's towards the front, you're going to get more front tyre wear. If it's towards the rear, you're going to get more rear tyre wear. So let's have a little look now at four-wheel drive. Now this is very similar to the FF cars because four-wheel drive cars tend to understeer a bit, so you tend to wear the front tyres out. But again, 5 to the rear, it's very stable. That's how I tend to start most Group 4 cars. I will start as a base setting all the way to the rear on brake bias for any track, and then I'll adjust and play around and see if there's a better setting. But that's how you run it. You see very smooth through there because even though it's all to the rear, four-wheel drive, a lot of traction, you want as much rotation as possible. So we'll switch it around now, go 5 to the front. And what you're going to see now is it won't actually be that much difference. Sometimes I have actually come across a few situations and variations where four-wheel drive cars on certain corners can react really well to a slight bit of front bias. But the only problem with this is if you're in a race situation with tyre wear quite high, you will kill your front tyres. Now you'll see now, even with the front 5 to the front now, it actually bites into the corner there and gets good traction out of the corner. Now this is a situation where I've come across quite a lot with four-wheel drive cars. It does tend to do that, but it's a tyre wear issue that you will see. Now we're going to have a little look at the FR cars in Group 4. Now again, 5 to the rear, it is oversteering slightly. It's not as bad as what obviously the Group 3 car would be like, but it's still controllable. You can actually run quite aggressive to the rear with the FR cars. You can see going into the final corner, a little bit of oversteer, but it's not drastic. It's still controllable. But if you go 5 to the front, again, you're going to get a lot of understeer, and this is why for the FR Group 4 cars, I tend to run my brake bias starting off between +2 and +3, and then I'll alter depending on the car, track, and what it feels like. It's a lot of experimenting involved with brake bias and finding what you like as a sweet spot. You're going to see now with this -5, going into this corner now, we're going to brake, and look at the lack of rotation. It just wants to drive off in a straight line. It doesn't want to rotate the rear, and again, that is why you're not going to run -5 with an FR car in Group 4. So now what we're going to do is try and show you where the variations come into play. Like a track like Brands Hatch in the Porsche 911. Now the Porsche 911 is a variation now within the MR cars, because they seem to have stabilized the rear a lot more than a lot of the other cars, so you can actually run the brake bias more aggressively to the rear. You can see we're running -5 now, and I just went out straight away, did one lap with -5, then straight away went back out with +5 to the rear, just to compare the differences. And what I picked up with the Porsche was that -5 did not feel very nice at all. I used to run this car before the latest update model for the physics on about -2 at this track, but now that would not be the preferable way to run this car. And this is where you've really got to just experiment, because different cars are going to feel different. You're going to see now with this -5, we're picking up a lot of understeer. We're not getting the rotation we want through the fast corners. So through corners like there, we want the car to be biting into the apex. You know, fast corners in general, you want more rear bias, because rear bias will help you out in the faster flowing corners. It's the really heavy braking zones where you tend to want a little bit more towards neutral or minus brake bias, because it's going to help stability on the car. You can see the understeer we get through there because of the lack of rotation again, and it's just not biting into the apex. We're missing apex because of the way that the braking is not biting us into the corner, and the trail braking is not having the effect that we want as we come through the final corner. On the power as early as I dare because of the understeer, and we're going to go over the line. It's not going to be a particularly great lap. Remember, I've just jumped on and just done a lap quickly at 24.7. Now I do expect the second lap straight away to be a slightly faster. We just jumped straight on another lap now. Now we're going to go to the rear with the brake bias. You see, flicking it to the rear, 5 to the rear, and see how this behaves. Now this is surprising because I would never have ran the Porsche on 5 to the rear before the latest physics model, but you can actually drive it now. Straight away you're going to see now through turn 1, watch the way this car rotates into the corner under braking. Look how it bites into the apex, and we're able to get on the power so much earlier. And look at the ghost in the distance, just because of that brake bias change. And even into this corner, which in general turn 2 at Brands Hatch is always a corner where you do not want rear bias, the Porsche just copes with it. So this car now is kind of like, it's one of them cars within Group 3 that seems to be slightly against the trend of other MR cars. The Ferrari, the Renault, the Audi, they all tend to prefer that front bias to help stabilise them. But the Porsche now seems to be a car that likes a little bit of rear bias. Now I wouldn't run this, if this was a time trial session, I wouldn't run the Porsche at Brands Hatch with +5, but I would consider maybe +3, because look how it bites into these fast corners with this now. Now the Porsche through there, normally you'd want about +2 to +3, because that's going to really help it rotate through the corner. And that's where the fast corners, you obviously want the more rear bias. But look at the difference. Even through this corner, we're into the corner nice and are able to get on the power so much earlier because of the rotation. And biting, it's just really biting that front end into the apex because of the rear. It's got that brake bias on the rear, which is helping rotate the car. And this is why I always say about experimenting, and it's down to preference, because this might not be drivable for some other drivers. I really don't know. But it's definitely been a change on the physics where it's affecting the Porsche, and there are other cars within the FR Group 3s as well that are very similar. Like the Corvette, I don't like to really run rear bias. I tend to like it still more to the front, maybe -1, -2, because that car can be quite aggressive on oversteer. So it's all down to preference. But one big thing you need to pay attention to when you're picking your brake bias is tyre wear. This is just a quick experiment. Now, we've already done an outlap and we drove it quite aggressive. We've got times 30 tyre wear on to exaggerate the issue. We're still running obviously the hard tyres, but what you're going to see now as we go through the start of this is the start of lap 2, so technically you're just starting lap 31, but with times 15, by the time you come to the end of the lap, you've basically done 30 laps in reality. So you see now for this lap I've gone all the way to the rear with the Audi. Now the Audi does kill its tyres, so I'm using this to try and emphasise a point with the brake bias, how it affects your tyre wear, and I think it's really important. You can see the oversteer. This is all because this brake bias is taking a lot of wear out of the rear tyres. You can see already, we're only starting lap 2, so obviously we have exaggerated the tyre wear with times 30, but what you're seeing is a massive, it's just really it's sliding around, it's not controlled, and because when you slide with an exaggerated tyre wear, you take more life out of the tyre. And in general, your brakes are obviously heating them rear tyres up more, which is creating more tyre wear as well. And as you're going to see now, we're going to come through to midway point on the lap now, going through the fast flowing corners. Now, look at the oversteer there. This is because we took too much life out of the rear tyres. You can see the front tyres don't look too bad at all, but the rears have took a lot of wear, and it's really not coping well. Look at the massive amount of oversteer I'm getting. I'm really struggling to drive this car with this brake bias and that amount of tyre wear, and we finally come to a point where it's too much and we spin. So we actually, just before the spin, we stopped it and took a screenshot of the tyre wear. Now we've gone all the way to the front bias, and we're going to come to the same point in the lap, exactly the same, midway through lap 2, and stop it at the point where we spun when we had the brake bias all the way to the rear, killing the tyres. And watch the difference here now. So this is the tyre wear with all the way to the rear. Now look at the difference when we've put it to the front. That's at the exact same point, and look how much better them rear tyres are. Just look at the difference on there. The bottom one is all the way to the rear, the top one is all the way to the front, and that is why we do a lot of brake bias changes. It is such a big difference. It will obviously give you more front wear when you're putting your brake bias to the front, but with a car that's going to chew its tyres up at the rears like that, that's why you in general are going to go towards the front with a car like that, because then in the race it's going to be a more balanced tyre wear, it's going to keep you more consistent, and sometimes that can mean one less pit stop. And with the way that Polyphony run these FIA races with the exaggerated tyre wear, it's really important to look after your tyres, because sometimes it can mean that one less pit stop, which is really key to getting a good result in a race. So I don't think everyone's aware of these issues within the game, in terms of moving the brake bias to save the tyre wear, and I think it's really important to let everyone know and be aware of this. I hope this has helped you out. What we'll do now is we're going to have a little look at a kind of a base setting that you will use for most cars on GT Sport. Now this isn't the exact settings. This is what I'm just going to give out as a rough guide to what settings you should run on your Group 3 and Group 4 cars. So first up, we'll go and talk about the MR Group 3 cars. Now in general, I tend to run -1 to -3, but like I say, there are the Porsche, for example, now where you probably can go more towards the rear. But in general, that is how I would run my brake bias to start off with on the track, and then adjust as you test it out. Now FR cars in Group 3, so like the AMG GT3, the Ford Mustang, I would always start between +1 and +3, and then adjust as you drive around and start feeling whether the rear's sliding, or if it's not grip enough, or it's not rotating enough. That's how you judge your brake bias. Now within Group 4, the MR Group 4s, I always start between 0 and +3, because MR Group 4 cars tend to have more grip, so you can actually go a little bit rearwards, and then you can adjust as you drive it around. Now the FR Group 4 cars, I tend to start between +2 and +4. Sometimes you end up on +1, but I always start around +2 and sometimes go to +4, depending on the track and whether it's a lot of fast corners or slower, heavy braking zones. Group 4, four-wheel drive, I always start +5. Sometimes I will go more towards the front, maybe like +2, +3, but in general, I will always start on +5, as that's my preference for the base setting. And it's exactly the same for the FF cars, all the way to the rear. And especially with tyre wear, you can't really afford to run your brake bias towards the front, because you will kill your front tyres in these cars if you do that. Now there are different circumstances that you obviously need to factor in with other cars like Group 2. It's the same theories, but the brake bias might not be as exaggerated. It's just a case of trial and error. Hopefully this video can kind of give you some advice in terms of altering other cars. I've already done the brake bias video for Group 1s in terms of the hybrid system, so that kind of goes against what we're saying here, because you generate more hybrid input by going more towards the rear on Group 1 cars, and as a result you kind of sacrifice a little bit of handling to generate more power, because the overall lap time is going to be better. So that's why we do that in Group 1. Now other cars like road cars, I'm not, the same theories are going to work, but whether you will do it to the same extent, it just depends on the car and stuff like that. So you really need to test this out, and we could spend all day going through every car and combination, but I think as a rough guide to try and help you out, hoping this video will have give you some insight into why we sometimes change brake bias, whether it's to do with tyre wear, the way the car handles, where the weight displacement is on the car. So obviously for the front wheel drive cars, all the weight's at the front. For the front engine rear wheel drive cars, the weight's more towards the front, but then your power's at the rear. So that's why them cars tend to have really good tyre wear, because they're quite balanced, but they do wear out the fronts on a lot of tracks that are front limited. So you really do need to test and play around with your brake bias. But if you ever want to test which setting's going to give you the best tyre wear, you really should do what I did there. It's really good to see the results. Run times 30 tyre wear, go to the track, try and get your brake balance that you like and compare it to other brake balances. You can see after 2-3 laps the difference between the tyre wear. It's really noticeable. So you can kind of test which way is going to give you the better tyre wear. So I would advise doing that. I did it for this guide on the brake bias, and I think you can actually get some pointers from that. Anyway, I hope this video has helped you out in some way. Obviously, brake bias, you could go on and on about it all day. It's very preferential. Some people will like one way, some people like another way. This is how I run brake bias, so I'm not saying it's the correct way. What I'm saying is this is how I start my laps, and this is how, when I go into time trial, as a general rule, them base settings is what I start off with, and then I adjust as I go on. So I hope it helps you out. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if it has helped you out. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already subscribed, and make sure you click that notification button so you don't miss any future videos. I do upload pretty much as possible, normally every day or 5 times a week, and I do try and stream as much as possible every week as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you soon, and make sure you give the video a thumbs up. Thanks again for watching, everyone.